One thing that I've found helpful in writing the equation in a case like this is maybe to start with a sketch just to figure out kind of what's going on here. So what I have is, well, I'll just kind of get my sketch started here. This time I'm given a range of values, so the high and low point of the graph. So let me go ahead and start getting that on the graph. The graph has a low point of -5, so let me count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the graph goes up 3, so 1, 2, 3. So there's the high and the low of the graph. I guess using that I can find the midline because it's going to just be, well, the middle of those. And so I can eyeball it or I can count it, but I see that the middle of this is going to be at -1. It's going to be halfway between the low and high values. Mathematically, what we're doing is we're just finding the average of the range. So if you take 3 and add -5 to it and divide by 2 to find the average, that's another way to find out that my midline is at -1. Okay, so that's a good thing to note for when I go to write this equation. Also, I suppose that's going to help me find the amplitude out, because remember, the amplitude is just the distance from the midline to the maximum, the highest point of the graph. So the amplitude in this case must be 4. Okay, so I've got a couple things figured out just like that. One thing that's important to note, and I messed this up when I tried this problem on my own earlier, even though I wrote the problem, is that they tell me this is a sine graph. And so the reason that's important is because I know it's a sine graph and I begin decreasing from the y-axis. Well, remember, sine graphs always start from the midline, so my sine graph must start here. I had tried doing something up here. I don't know what I was thinking. I was thinking it was cosine for some reason. But it says it's a sine graph and it starts by decreasing. So it must be kind of like that shape. Well, the reason that that's important to know, and what I kind of catch only if I sketch it, is that a sine wave that starts like that by decreasing must be reflected, because that's not the way a sine wave usually begins. So that's another reason it's, I think, a good idea to sketch these to figure out what's going on. So the fact that the graph is reflected will come into play in a few minutes too, or a few moments, once we write our equation. Okay, so we know it's a sine, we know the amplitude, we know what the midline is, we know what's been reflected. There's one more piece of information I need to write my equation, and that's what the b value is. The b value is associated with the period, but it's not the period itself. So let's go ahead and do a little work and find out what the b value is. I'm going to write 0.25 pi as just pi over 4. It's the same thing. And then we know that the period is equal to 2 pi, the normal period, divided by the b value. So that's the equation, the proportion I'm going to want to solve to find b. So if I do some cross multiplying, I would get 8 pi is equal to b times pi, and if I divide both sides by pi, those will cancel out, and so all that's left is that b is 8 to make the period that I have. So using all of these pieces of information, I should now be able to write the equation of this sine function. So remember, we always want to start with f of x equals or y equals. Equations should have equal signs. So I know that it's equal to the amplitude, which is 4 in this case, but since we know it's reflected, that must be a -4. That'll be the only way to get the sine wave to begin by decreasing like we had here. So I'm going to do -4 times the sine, because they said it was a sine graph. I need the b value next. We know that's 8. Don't forget the x. Some people forget that. And then I'm going to throw that in parentheses. Even though I don't think we technically need those, I'm going to make sure that that's in parentheses. And the last piece of this is going to be just that midline adjustment, which we know from the range the midline had been moved down 1, so a -1. And so there is going to be the equation of this function.